Hey everybody, this is Games Plus James, and today we're going to take a look at how to use custom cursors in Unity. So if you have some kind of game, maybe, I don't know, a point and click game or a strategy simulation game, you might want to change the mouse pointer that's being shown on screen. You don't want this boring old standard Windows looking mouse pointer that we have here. We want to be able to change it, and you want to be able to change it on the fly as you go through your game. Now there's a couple of simple ways that you can do it, but are limiting your control of what can happen. So we'll show the most basic way before we go too much further. Now, one of the first things you need to do when you want to use custom cursors in Unity, obviously you're going to need some images to use. I've got a few little ones set up here, but what's really important is that on all your images that you want to use as a cursor, you go up to the top up here, and where it has texture type, you switch it to where are we? Cursor. There we go. So we want to make sure we're using cursor images to show our cursor in our game. Now you can use normal sprite images to just show a default cursor that we're going to show in a second, but it won't work when we want to actually start switching our cursors to different objects. So we want to make sure that we set this to cursor. Now with that done, we can apply all those, and then we can go up to File, Build Settings, and if we go to Player Settings here, you'll see in the player settings there's an option for default cursor. So we can switch that out for one of the cursor images we have here. So I could click and drag them here, or I could hit select and just select this little blue arrow here, and I can close this. And now if I go down here, you can see as soon as I hover over the game view, my cursor switches. So that's perfectly fine. That would work in our game. If I press play here, now we've got a nice little blue cursor. So you're making things look different already. But we want to have a bit more control over our cursors than that. Well, we want to be able to switch our cursor to different types when you run a game. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of that. So I'm going to go back to my build settings, player settings, and I'm going to click on this and hit delete. So I have no default cursor being shown, and we're going to set it in our game ourselves. Now to do that, we're obviously going to need some scripts to control it. So I'm going to go to my scripts, and I'm going to first of all create a C# script that I will call cursor controller, like so, and we'll open this up in Visual Studio, and we're going to make it so that this is the thing that's going to control switching our cursors to display different cursors as we go. So with that in mind, we're going to make it so that other scripts can access this script and then use this to set it. So for example, if I jump back in here for a second, I'm going to make this first red block here have a script attached to it that tells the cursor controller to change it to the blue cursor that we just made. So let's go back in here. So if we're going to want to access this from other scripts, we're going to make it a singleton. So we're going to say public static cursor controller that we'll call instance. So if you don't know what a singleton is, it basically is this is going to be one single instance of this object that can only exist in the world. So there'll only ever be one version of this in the world, so it makes it easy for every object to find it. So then to be able to set it, we want to go to the awake function and say instance equals this. So let's just save this, and we'll attach it to a game object back in our scene. So I'm going to I'll just create an empty game object for now. It doesn't really matter what we attach this to in our example here. So I've got my cursor controller. So now as soon as the game starts, although we don't see the public instance that we just created here, if I press play, as soon as the game starts, it goes, okay, it calls awake, and it says this cursor controller, this particular script here, is equal to the instance variable. So now if we had multiple scripts in the game, only one of them could ever be the instance. It changes to all of them at once. It's very simple, and it's very powerful, and it's very easy to use. So the reason we do that is, back in here, now we can have a reference to all the different cursors that we want to set. So I'm going to say public. What we need to do is texture 2D. So texture 2D is the sprite type that we're using. So back in here, in our cursors, you'll see these are a texture type. Now we set it to be the cursor type, but they're a texture 2D is what they are. Is what a cursor is classified as, basically. So public texture 2D, so we're going to want the let's say we'll call it the blue cursor. We're also going to set ones up that we're going to take a look at in a few moments for the crosshairs, we'll have a hand open and a hand closed. Okay, so with that done, we're going to create a few functions. Well, we're going to create one for now, but the first function we're going to create is public void activate blue cursor in here. And very simply, the really simple way that we set the image for our cursor is to just say cursor dot set cursor. And then in here we need to give in some values. So the first thing we want to do is set the type of cursor we want to do. So we know that's the blue cursor image up here. So blue cursor we'll put in there. The next thing it asks for is the hotspot. So the hotspot is where on the image we want basically clicks to happen from. So if we go back in here and look at the cursor image, if I just double click on this here, we know that, hey, if you're using this as your mouse pointer, we want all our clicks to happen from the top left here. And by default, the top left will be the area that your image uses as its click point, or its hotspot as it calls it in Unity. So that means when you click on something, it'll basically say, okay, we're clicking wherever the top left pixels here are in our image. So as that is the default, we can say the amount we want to change that is vector2.0. So we don't want to change it on the x-axis and we don't want to change it on the y-axis. So we're happy with that. And then finally, we need to set the cursor mode, which will just say cursor mode dot auto. Now we don't need to worry too much about what this is. Cursor mode is just whether you're using a hardware or software mouse. It's a thing we don't need to worry about. We just tell it to know what's the default setting, basically. Okay, so we know how to activate our blue cursor. So let's jump back into Unity and just set this script up first of all. So on my game object, I'm going to put in the textures I want to go in here. So I've got my blue cursor, I've got my crosshairs, I've got a hand open and a hand closed. And then, sorry, what we then need to do is I'm going to set up this cursor, this cube here, to call that function. So I'm going to create a new script, and I'm going to say create a C# script. We'll just call this activate blue cursor. And before we make any changes, we'll add this to our cursor cube here. And then in this function, all it's going to have is just down here, we're going to say on mouse enter. So on mouse enter gets called whenever, if you go back in here, whenever the mouse itself enters the collider area of this cube. So as soon as it enters this collider area, Unity looks for the on mouse enter function that's attached to this script. So then back in here, and when we enter the mouse, we can just say cursor controller dot instance, which we know has been set as soon as the game starts running. It goes, hey, instance equals this. So we can access the instance, and then on that we can say activate blue cursor. Save that, and if we go back in here, once that compiles, now we can press play. And if I go here, there we go, look, it switches to the blue cursor as soon as we hover over this mouse. So let's see some other things. So I want to set up a crosshair to happen. So I'm going to create another function here, or another script here to activate the crosshair. So I'm going to call this, create this and say activate crosshair. And we're just going to make an example of something else we might want to do with switching our cursors here. So I'm going to pop that on there. Now obviously to do this, we'll want an ability to activate the crosshair. So back in our cursor controller, we're going to add another function. So we're going to say public void activate crosshair, like so. And we're going to say cursor dot set cursor, and this time we're going to set it to be the crosshairs. For the moment, I'm going to say vector2.0 again, and we'll see why that doesn't work for us. And we'll just say cursor mode dot auto. Okay, save that, jump back in here, and then once that's compiled, I can then go to my crosshair script and I'll open this up. And then again, when on mouse enters the area, so on mouse enter, we're going to say cursor controller dot instance dot activate crosshair. Now obviously that's essentially just the exact same thing as we've done before, so that's not the most interesting thing to do. So instead what we're also going to do is add a void on mouse exit. So when we're no longer hovering the object, we're going to switch it from activating the crosshair to bringing us back to the blue cursor. So we'll say cursor controller dot instance dot activate blue cursor. Okay, save that, and we'll go back into our scene. So once that's compiled, then we should be able to play. And if I see, we go and activate our blue cursor, and if I switch to my crosshair, you can see I've got my crosshair, but now I switch back to my blue arrow. Okay, so that's all fine and well, but what about where we're clicking? So we talked about the hotspot being at the top left of our image, so for our little blue mouse here, that makes sense. And I've actually got a very simple script set up so that if I click, it'll create a little ball where we are. But if I go here, and if I click, oh well, that didn't help because we can't see where the crosshair is. Hold on, for 1 second, I'm just going to remove the bit of code that shows our mouse exit, or switches it back on mouse exit. Just let it compile here. So if I press play again, once I switch onto this guy, we've got our cursor now in general. So now if I click, you can see we're clicking in the wrong place. So our click is registering up way too high. And that's no good for us. So what we want to do is we want to have our click being in the exact center of our crosshairs. And how we do that is, if we go back into our script and we'll go to our cursor controller, where we're setting the hotspot of our image down here, we're saying vector 2.0, we don't want to change the position of where it is at all. But what we want to do is actually change it now. So we need to move it. If I just get my crosshair image, we want to move, so it's at the moment it's up here, and we want to move it halfway across and then halfway down. So how we can do that is just get the width of the image and the height of the image and divide that by 2, and then we're saying that's where we want it to move to. So all we have to do here, instead of saying vector 2.0 for the hotspot, we can say a new vector 2. On the x-axis, we want it to be crosshairs dot width divided by 2. And then on the y-axis, we want it to be crosshairs dot height divided by 2. Oh, I need to close that bracket. And now I can save this, and we'll jump back in, and we should see now, when I press play, when we hover over the object, you can see straight away where the mouse center is. It's actually centering to the right place of where the mouse pointer is. So look at the top left, or the very top of the mouse here, and when I click and drag down, we switch exactly to this, and now when I click, our ball is appearing right in the middle where it should be. So perfect, that's working the way we want to. So that's how we can control the position of the cursor, and how we can make it so that the position makes a bit more sense, and how we're able to switch from one cursor to another. But let's make things a little bit more interesting. What about when we want to make it so that we can interact with an object? So when we click on an object, we switch between having an open hand and a closed hand. Well, we're going to need 2 functions for that. We're going to need public void activate hand open and public void activate there we go, hand closed. And for these, I'm going to, if we look back at our hand objects here, I'm going to assume that we want this to be in the middle as well, the same as we have for the cursor. So I'm going to just basically copy this line of code from our crosshairs, and I'm going to switch crosshairs out for hand open, paste it in again, and switch crosshairs out for hand closed, like so. And then obviously we're going to need another script So back in here, I'm going to go to my scripts folder and I'm going to create, we'll call this one grabbable. Very simple. Go to my cube, attach it there, and then in our grabbable script, this is going to be a little bit more interesting. So we're going to have on our on mouse enter. In here, we're going to say cursor controller dot instance dot activate hand open. And we also want to keep track of where our hand is. So we want to say, hey, if our hand is here, then we want to be able to grab this object. So we're going to create a private bool that we'll call can grab. So when our hand enters the area, we're going to say we can grab it. So can grab equals true. And then we're going to have on mouse exit, where we're going to say can grab equals false. And for the moment, I'm not going to switch it back to the other cursor. We'll take a look at how to do something slightly different with that in a moment. But we're going to say, okay, so now we know when the mouse enters the area that we can grab something, and when I exit the area, we can no longer grab it because we're no longer hovering over the item. And then we're going to say in our update loop, if we can grab the object, then we'll say, hey, if the player clicks the button, so if input.get mouse button 0, so basically if they left click, then set the cursor controller dot instance dot activate hand closed. So we're going to switch to closing the hand. And then down here we're going to say if the input dot get mouse button up, sorry, that should be get mouse button down, I just realized. So we want it when the button is clicked. So then we're going to say if the get mouse button is up, so if we're unclicking, if we're releasing our click, then switch the hand back to being open. So cursor controller dot instance dot activate hand open. Okay, so let's save that. We'll see this in action. Let it compile. And when I press play, now we should see we switch to our hand. When I click, now we look like we're grabbing this object and I can let go. And that's all fine and dandy. We're happy with that. But if I move off, we're still got this hand. That's perfectly fine. But if I was to do this and click and then move off, now when I release, oh no, it doesn't switch back to the other hand because we're no longer grabbing this object. So obviously really what we should do is, no matter whether you're trying to grab it or not, whether you're clicking this button, we should switch away from being this cursor. We don't want to have this cursor being activated, basically. So what we could do is make it switch to the blue cursor, but what would actually be really nice is if we can see how to switch back to our normal Windows cursor. And how we can do that is, back in our cursor controller, we're going to create one more function. We're going to say public void clear cursor. And all we have to do for this is just say cursor dot set cursor, and instead of giving a value in here, we just say null. So we're telling it that there's no image that we want to use. So basically it knows then to go, okay, just reset the default Windows image. So then null, we still need to set the hotspot, so we can say vector2.0 again, because we obviously want our pointer to be working the way it should. And we'll again just say cursor mode dot auto. Okay, we'll save that. And then back on our grabbable function, down here when we on mouse exit, here we're going to say cursor controller dot instance dot clear cursor. And we'll go back in here. And now when I press play, we should see if I hover over it, we switch back to our normal cursor. And if I click and grab, you can see as soon as we go off it, we are no longer grabbing the object. And just to make sure it is working, I can go to my blue one first, switch to my hand, and then go back to this one. So very simply, that's how you can have a lot more control over the cursors you use in your game. It's really simple to do, but also very powerful, and it gives a lot of good feedback to the player. It's really helpful to let the player know that there's an object that we can click on here, and it gives a really good visual feedback and lets players understand that there's something they can interact with. So thanks for watching this episode. I'll be back soon with more tutorial gaming goodness, and in the meantime, keep being awesome.